Well, as you heard earlier, we're going to be starting our 7-week fall series next week based on a book that's called Finding Yourself in Transition by Reverend Robert Brummett. And I figured it was only logical that before you can find yourself, right, you have to lose yourself first. Which brings us to the question for the day. What exactly is the self? Or, to put it another way, who am I? Or who are you? Or as my mother used to say when she was upset with me, just who exactly do you think you are, mister? And I knew enough then that was a question that there was no answer to that. You best not answer it. But we want to deal with it. We want to think about that question a little bit this morning, because when we try to answer the question, who am I? What often happens? Don't we come up with a long list of roles, titles, names, stories, our likes, our dislikes, our physical attributes, all sorts of things like that, this big long list, and that can be a real eye-opener for a lot of people. And they come away from the process with even more questions like, gosh, is that all there is to me? This pile of labels that I use to describe what I do and what I look like and what I like and I don't like, and on and on and on. Robert Brummett, he wrote another book that we worked with a few years back, and he says that trying to answer the question, who are you, is like trying to describe a hole in the wall. We can take measurements, but all that does is to describe the surrounding wall. We could describe what you can see through the hole, but that really says nothing about the true nature of the hole itself. And eventually, we reach the conclusion that really the only way that we can describe the hole is by describing what surrounds it. That's as close as the human mind can get to describing the essence of anything. All we can do is come up with this list of elements, parts, and attributes, and that's what we do to ourselves. We spend our lives creating the list, and we call it the self. Now, the Latin word for self or I is ego. Isn't that interesting? We get stuck at the ego level, totally focused on and identified with that list that we've made in our futile effort to describe ourself. And the ego is totally identified with that laundry list of elements, the parts and the attributes, and that's because the ego, like the list, is a product of the mind. It's a product of our thinking. That song earlier, as a person thinketh, that's what his life becomes. That's how it works. The mind can't comprehend the existence of something that doesn't show up on that list of elements and parts and attributes. Another example that Robert Brummett uses in his other book is to compare the mind to the beam of a flashlight that's shining in a totally dark room. Now, you can take that beam and you can scan the walls and the ceiling and the floor, and you can illuminate everything eventually in that room, but the one thing that you can never illuminate with that flashlight is the flashlight itself. Again, the human mind works the same way. The mind can't grasp the source of itself any more than the flashlight can illuminate itself. And Robert calls this inability of the mind to grasp its origin, he calls it a black hole. Buddhists call it emptiness or the void. And the ego, in case you haven't noticed, is going to resist any attempt to explore that black hole or that emptiness because it looks and feels like a threat to its very existence. And that's the big lie. That's the big lie, because what is in back of or beyond or behind that laundry list of the false self created by the ego and the mind is consciousness itself. And being able to see and experience that is liberating, not threatening. From Meister Eckhart to Eckhart Tolle, the mystics and contemplatives throughout the ages tell us that the way to lasting peace and happiness is learning to see how we are constantly being manipulated by this illusion of being a separate self, that list of attributes that's compiled by the mind. Now, a few weeks ago, you might recall, I was talking about unity and Eastern religions and how our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, was trying to bring meditation techniques from Eastern religions into our Western spiritual practice. And in the last year or so, there seems to have been an explosion of interest in meditation and mindfulness from people and organizations that we would not necessarily label as spiritual. For example, Time magazine from February of this year, they're calling it the mindful revolution. The mindful revolution. And personally, I think that everyone and everything is spiritual. And I'm not alone in that assessment, but for a lot of folks, if it doesn't come from Oprah, Chopra, or Dyer, it ain't spiritual. Well, as you can see from that Time magazine cover, mindfulness is spreading in places where we don't always see it. So that was in February of this year, and then started coming the books. I've already told you about this one. It's called Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion by Sam Harris, who was a guy that nobody would ever think of as particularly spiritual, but he is a longtime student of meditation. And then there's another book that Karen and I just picked up. It's called 10% Happier. How I Tamed the Voice in My Head, Reduced Stress Without Losing My Edge, and Found Self-Help That Actually Works. A true story. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of Dan Harris, and by the way, he's no relation to Sam Harris. They're totally different people, no relation at all. If his name isn't familiar to you, you might recognize him as the anchor of Nightline on ABC. This book is his story, his personal story of how he used meditation and mindfulness to deal with a crisis situation in his life that came up where he allowed the demands of his career and the stress of his life to cause him to have an on-the-air panic attack. He was filling in for Robin Roberts one morning on Good Morning America back in 2004 doing the news, and he had this on-air panic attack. And here's the first sentence of the first chapter of the book. He says, according to the Nielsen ratings data, 5.019 million people saw me lose my mind. Just remember that the next time that you think you've done or said something embarrassing, right? I mean, my goodness. And a few paragraphs later, he shares this with us. He says, my on-air meltdown was the direct result of an extended run of mindlessness. A period of time during which I was focused on advancement and adventure to the detriment of pretty much everything else in my life. It's not an uncommon story, and the rest of the book tells the before and after story about how he used meditation, mindfulness meditation, which by the way he learned out here at Spirit Rock, which is just over near San Rafael, I believe, the Vipassana Meditation Center. That's where he studied, and he learned how to literally change his life. And the part of the book title that I found very interesting was the part where he says, How I Tamed the Voice in My Head. Now, if we are totally honest with each other, and especially ourselves, right? We all have a voice in our head, don't we? Maybe it doesn't sound like anyone or anything in particular. It just might be thoughts in the form of words that we seem to hear. For some of us, it's a little more vivid than others, but there are these words that come to us in the form of thoughts that are produced by the mind and filtered through the laundry list of the attributes and parts that make up the ego. And you know what? This voice isn't always nice, is it? this voice isn't always nice. I was reading an interview of Dan Harris, which was conducted by Sam Harris, and Dan Harris was talking about the voice, and he said that the voice was mostly negative, repetitive, self-centered. Sound familiar? Anybody know the voice? Negative, repetitive, self-centered, and he came to the realization, he said that I realized that the things I'd done in my life that I was most ashamed of had been as a result of having thoughts, impulses, urges, and emotions that I didn't have the wherewithal to resist. In other words, it's an inside job. That's what's going on. The voice is created by the mind in the same way that it creates the laundry list of the false self, of the ego. They're part and parcel the same thing. They come at us in different ways. And that's the self that we want to tell to get lost. That's the self we want to tell to get lost. Not that we're ever going to do that. Not that we're ever going to succeed, but we at least want to be able to see it for what it is, and then maybe tame it, right? Make friends with it. This thing that we call the separate self with the often obnoxious voice is not the real me. It's not the real you. And that's the challenge, to see that illusion. It masquerades as us, but it's not the real us. It's something created by the mind, and then it gets added to the fundamental reality of consciousness. It's always going to be there, but we can make it behave. We're always going to have it, and even people who we might consider enlightened, they still have it too. They have to keep working at it. And that's one of the reasons why I find myself steering away from using the word enlightenment or enlightened, because it's come to mean, or it's come to be a word that refers to someone whose work, they're enlightened, right? So their work is done. And that's never the case. That's never the case. Enlightened simply means awake. And if you're truly awake, what you see is the work that always still needs to be done. You may be able to claim enlightenment if you're sitting in bliss all by yourself at the top of a mountain someplace, but if you're around other people in this world of ours, you dare not rest on the laurels of so-called enlightenment and stop doing the work, or you will end up as something that Ken Wilber calls roadkill on the spiritual highway. There are a lot of so-called enlightened teachers and preachers of righteousness and salvation who get caught with their pants down, so to speak. On the mild side of the spectrum, spiritual teachers can lose their tempers and use bad words and things like that. And on the extreme side, they can engage in blatantly unethical conduct. And if you do find a spiritual teacher who doesn't seem to be falling prey to those things, well, you can bet that they're still working like hell to make friends with that inner voice of the false self. They might be a little more skilled at it than the rest of us, but they're still working on it. The Buddha was still working on it up to the day he died. So was Jesus. That's why there's the gospel story about what happens to Jesus after he gets baptized by his cousin John. The baptism is considered the moment where he finally becomes awakened to his true identity. That's when the voice says, "You are my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." He is awakened to his true identity, his true self, his Christ nature, the truth of his being that is other than and beyond that laundry list of the ego. So he's awakened to this revelation of his true nature, and he immediately heads off into the wilderness. And the story tells us, of course, he wants to be alone, right? But the first thing he runs into after his baptism, goes out into the wilderness, is the voice. He runs into the voice. And the story, it's called Satan. And if you look at the Greek word that they use for Satan, it can also be translated as tempter, accuser, or adversary. That's the voice, right? That's what it does. It tempts it accuses, it opposes. And I think it's instructive to think about how Jesus deals with the voice. He doesn't say, hey, I'm a fully enlightened being, Son of God, so I'm just going to pretend you don't exist. That's a great way to become spiritual roadkill. No, instead of ignoring it, he engages it. He debates it. And ultimately, through this process of engagement, he tames it. It goes away. He still has to work with it. He acknowledges it. He acknowledges its existence. And that's how he deals with it. So don't think that you have to be a meditation master with a dozen silent retreats under your belt before you can start to tame the voice. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is dealing with the same thing and roughly the same story. We all have a story, right? The thing I like about this book by Dan Harris is that we can all see aspects of ourselves in the story. I could piggyback on his story with my own story about the chaos and stress of being a trial lawyer for 20 years back in the day, and how he drove me working with the voice, because that's what it was all about. But this isn't about me. This isn't about Dan Harris either, actually. It's about you. It's about you. Where do you see yourself in this story? One of the things I really get from Dan Harris's story is that if a guy like him, who is so totally immersed in the insanely hectic and demanding world of network news in New York City, if he can find a way to learn how to take some time to tame the voice in his head, there's no excuse for the rest of us. There's really no excuse for the rest of us. And here's the really great news I want to share this morning. We're halfway there by just knowing, even on an intellectual level, that there's this false self constructed by the mind that has this voice that causes lots of problems. All right? Just knowing that. Even if we haven't yet had the experience of temporarily losing that sense of false self, of seeing through the illusion of the false self. Even if we haven't had that experience yet, and I guarantee you that the sense of self can indeed fall away for a time. So you can truly see how it's a construct, how it's an illusion. I promise you that can happen with this kind of practice. But even if you haven't had that experience yet, and this is the message today, because people say, oh, I can never meditate. I couldn't be like it. 5 minutes. Karen led you through a mindfulness meditation today. That's the kind of thing. If you can take 5 minutes a day to simply sit back and breathe and just watch how the thoughts come and go and come and go, and you realize that this is transient, it's impermanent, and it really has no power over you. Just something as simple as that. Even without having had that experience, just knowing and being willing to accept the fact that we're dealing with something that doesn't have really any independent existence is the first step on the road to greater happiness and freedom. That's what Dan Harris found out. So, losing yourself means losing the illusion that this laundry list of attributes is who I am. Losing the illusion of the false self with the annoying voice so that we can get down to the real work of knowing what's real. So, we're going to be getting into our 7-week series, and one of the things that we're going to learn, finding yourself in transition or change, one of the things we're going to find out is that the reason that change and transition is so challenging and uncomfortable is because change and transition is seen as a threat by the false self. And we can actually use times of change and transition in our life as opportunities to do this work of seeing the false self as the illusion that it is. And that process will start next week. Hope to see you then. Thank you.